Hi, it's Makaela here. Thanks for listening to my podcast. What you're about to listen to is an old episode of my podcast, The Midlife Awakening, which has now been replaced with the Deliberately Transformed Woman podcast. You'll still find some golden takeaways in these old episodes, but if you're the type of person who wants to discover and let go of the things that are holding you back in life by busting through fear and procrastination, overcoming imposter syndrome, and stepping into a life that is fulfilling, courageous, and intentional, then my new podcast episodes, starting from episode 21, are the ones you're looking for. You're listening to episode 1 of the Midlife Awakening podcast with Makaela Moore. Welcome to the Midlife Awakening podcast. I'm Makaela Moore, your host and certified transformation coach. I'm a 40-something woman who nerds out on brain science and believes every woman should be financially independent. This podcast is for women navigating their midlife who want to learn the secrets to unlocking their brain and freeing themselves from everything that holds them back so they can create lasting change in their lives, because everything is possible. Join me each week for conversations about the midlife and tips and tricks to hack your subconscious brain so you can deliberately transform your life and ultimately create your own financial security. First time here? Hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. Enjoy! Hello and welcome. I am so glad you're here. So I want to begin my podcast with a few stories just to give you an idea of who I am, what I'm about, and what you can expect from this podcast. I feel like there's so many stories to tell that would show, how I got to this place in my life. So I'm just going to start telling stories. Some of the stories I'm not going to go into in great detail, mainly because some of them I feel deserve a podcast of their own. So grab a cuppa, settle in, as I try not to fumble my way through my very first podcast episode. I've created this podcast for a few reasons. One, because it was totally out of my comfort zone to put myself out there, and I've been challenged to go beyond the comfort of my keyboard and my blog and do something extraordinary. Secondly, and most importantly, I'm super passionate about women taking life with both hands, giving it a bloody good shake, getting rid of the shit, and just creating that awesome life that they think, is only in a dream. I'm super passionate about women achieving their own financial security, regardless of, their current marital status or what have you. And I'm just super passionate about making the most of this one crazy life that we get. So I just want to help as many women as I can to achieve their goals in life. Hence this podcast. So I'm a certified life coach, and the journey to get here was anything but direct. There were ups and there were downs and wins and losses, but without all the downs, there wouldn't have been any of the ups, and without the failures, the successes would have been like nothing. I learned a while ago that, life was never going to be handed to me on a silver platter, nor would a knight in shining armour ever come and save the day and, therefore my life. I got married and divorced in my early 20s, and leaving that marriage took guts. Guts that until that moment the words came out of my mouth, I never even knew I had. I walked away with nothing and I started my life over. I was working as a receptionist, and then when I was about 27, I started university. 6.5 years and several job promotions later, I had a shiny business and human resources degree and a great job in human resources. I travelled overseas on my own to, some awesome places like Egypt and Dubai, and gorgeous places like Italy and Paris and the UK. And I've got to say, travelling on my own taught me so much about myself. After I returned, I thought I had my life mapped out. I promptly fell down some stairs and I broke both my ankles, dramatically changing the trajectory of my life. I went from a vibrant, single, 35-year-old career woman who had just moved into this cute little inner city unit to someone who was dependent on others, and by others, I mean my dear old dad. I moved into his house for a few months until I was, back on my feet. It was one of those experiences that at the time had me all caught up in my woe and misery. In hindsight, it was a good thing. I know that sounds ridiculous, but it actually was a good thing. My dad and we'd had this rocky relationship, since my early 20s, and we'd only just reconnected about a year earlier. So we were still testing the waters of our new relationship. But living with him for a few months and having him look after me gave me a whole new perspective, and we developed this bond that we'd never had before. And we've still got it to this day, which is awesome. After my accident, I had a shit couple of years with health issues, including depression and anxiety. The woman who, had only 6 months earlier gone to discover the pyramids of Egypt on her own was flat out going to the local supermarket. Anxiety was a total bitch. Still is sometimes. A couple of years later, a work colleague of mine gave my number to one of her husband's workmates. We met a few weeks later in what I suppose was a blind date. We'd spoken on the phone, but, we had no idea what the other looked like, which, after some unsuccessful internet dating, it was a bit daunting. We met for drinks one January afternoon. Within 2 weeks, we were inseparable. Within 2 months, we'd bought a house together and moved in. I think within about 5 months, we were engaged. By the July of that year, just as I'd turned 39, we decided that we'd start trying for a baby. Because let's face it, at 39, I wasn't getting any younger. By the September, we were pregnant. Freaking miracle, thank you. And we got married the next January, 12 months to the day from when we met. That was 8 years ago, and a lot has happened since then. A lot. Our daughter Sydney, who is now 7, she was born by Caesar at 35 weeks because I had complications, which meant she then had complications. And that merry-go-round began. She was a reflux baby. She never slept. She screamed 24/7. When she was 3 months old, we went to a sleep clinic for families with babies. I got to spend my 40th birthday in that clinic, and our celebration was a quick lunch out and hospital sandwiches for dinner. I look back now and so much of it seems insignificant, but at the time we were living a nightmare. On top of that, I was experiencing a bit of postnatal depression, which really made for fun and joy. Not. I was really struggling. I struggled with having an infant and all that goes with it. I wasn't coping with the lack of sleep, and I was having a total identity crisis. Like, who the hell was I? 1 minute, I've got this great job as a senior human resources advisor in government, with my life mostly in order. And then the next minute, I was living in a world of chaos and nappies and screaming and a total lack of identity. I'd never wanted to only be a stay-at-home mum. I always knew I wanted to be a mum, but I had the fantasy in my head, and it was nowhere near my reality. I know I wasn't alone there, though. When Sydney was about 5 months old, I received a phone call that I thought was probably the worst news in the world at the time. I was being made redundant from my much-loved job in government, but that was along with 14,000 others, so I wasn't feeling particularly special. The knowledge that I had that job title and would be going back to that job in a couple of months, it had been keeping me going, and now, that was gone. So, what the hell would I do now? Who was I? And again, in hindsight, I can see that I was basing my self-worth on a job title, which I wouldn't even dream of doing now, but back then, that's how it was. Even though my planned maternity leave was still a few months, I jumped into action and started looking for a new job because heaven help anyone call me a stay-at-home mum. Now, for all the stay-at-home mums who might be listening to this, please keep listening because I promise it gets better. That was just my state of mind at the time. So I did get a job. I was teaching Diploma of Business at a private college, and I hated it. It was the most horrible place to work, horrible people, and it wasn't fulfilling for me, and I just didn't belong there. So after 8 months, I decided to leave there, and Graham and I decided that we'd start our own business. And that was my new purpose in life. So, my hubby he'd been working as a cabinet maker for the same company for 24 years. So it was a really good opportunity to put his trade skills and my business brain together and do something for ourselves. It was wonderful. I got to work from home with some daycare and some nana care for Sydney, and I had the best of both worlds. We built that business up, doubling our income each year, so that by the third year, we were grossing almost $1 million. In the meantime, we bought our dream home on 5 acres, which, while it had good bones and was very functional, needed a bit of a renovation. But that's okay because we love renovating, and having already done our previous house together, we knew we could do this one too. The business was just getting busier and busier, and we thought rather than renovating our home straight away, why don't we get into house flipping? Everyone else is doing it and making shit tons of money, so we could do it too. We've got all these skills and trades available. I've got a keen eye for detail, and I love interior design. And the profit that we'd make on this one, it could fund the purchase of the next and the next and the next. And, then we'd have the money to renovate our own home exactly how we wanted to. So we bought our first flip house. It was a little unassuming brick house in the Brisbane suburb of Zilmere, which had been owned by this lovely old man who had never done a thing to it. It was so ugly, but we had grand plans for it. We were going to make a mozza on this reno. Nothing could stop us. But it did. Originally, our plan was to spend a maximum of 3 months renovating that house and then sell it to minimise our holding costs. But we got slammed with work. It got put off by a month or so because, we had to pay for it, so work was our priority. But then Graham hit burnout, and it wasn't just the ordinary need a week of sleep and she'll be right type of burnout. It was way more than that. Graham developed what we thought was just a rash on his ankles, but within hours, it was looking more and more like meningococcal. To cut a long story short, he ended up in hospital with a mystery illness. Fortunately, not meningococcal, but nobody knew what it was, and his legs were growing by the minute. His feet and his ankles and up to his knees were full of these giant blood blisters. Like, his legs looked like giant reddish purple lumpy lobsters. And at one point the doctors were saying that they hoped to avoid amputation. Yes, amputation. That one little word sent me into an absolute tailspin. I mean, for starters, that's my husband you're talking about, the love of my life. Far out. And he's my big, strong, tradie husband who, without legs, probably can't do kitchen renovations very well. Yes, we had a couple of employees, but Graham was the absolute backbone of our business. And I just remember thinking, what the hell were we going to do? Graham was in hospital for I think it was a week, and it was the longest week of my life. And I was seriously stressed. I was emotional. I was a wreck. I cried myself to sleep, but then didn't sleep. I drank too much. I ate too little. Every imaginable thought and scenario went through my head that week. I had to keep it together for Sid, she would have been 5 at the time. And, she was in prep, so at least she was occupied through the day. But it turned out Graham had a severe allergic reaction, either to some antibiotics he was taking for a sinus infection or a reaction to the sinus infection itself. We still to this day don't know. He spent that week in hospital, on a concoction of drugs, and when he came home, I changed those bandages on his feet and ankles morning and night for about 5 or 6 weeks, and the whole thing really knocked him around, and he's actually scarred for life. He did get back to work, sort of. He was able to do some office work and some light duties, but nothing too strenuous for about 3 months. Fortunately, we had 2 employees who kept the business ticking over with an income coming in, but it wasn't really enough to cover everything. Meanwhile, that flip house of ours just sat. We couldn't do anything with it. We couldn't sell it and we couldn't rent it because it had been gutted and was essentially an empty shell waiting to be fixed and filled. It sat there for months without any action. We didn't have the money to bring in any other trades to work on it, and the holding costs just depleted any money that we had left that, we'd set aside for the renovation. Eventually, about 9 months after first buying that house, Graham, who was now mostly back on his feet, rounded up the boys and they just went full force into finishing off that house. Every now and then you'd find Graham napping on the floor of one of the bedrooms while everyone worked around him. But, we all pitched in and we got that house finished. And I had so much fun decorating that house with, to within an inch of its life, that I just knew the first person who'd see it would buy it for top dollar. I was wrong. The market took a nosedive about 3 minutes before we listed the house for sale. It took 6 weeks to sell, but we did eventually sell it, and for much less than we'd dreamed of. And so after exactly 12 months and 17 days of ownership and all the blood, sweat, tears and tantrums, we walked away from that house dead even. All that work for nothing. On paper, we were dead even, but in reality, it was a big fat loss, because time we spent on that could have been spent, in or on our business actually earning money for us, not losing it. After all that, and realising how close we came to Graham being permanently impaired, I came to some bloody big realisations. The first one was that we needed a second source of income, because I never wanted to go through that again. We need better financial security for our future, and while Graham worked to pay for our current cost of living, I was going to find something to create our future wealth. So not long after that, I saw a segment on a news program which highlighted the growing epidemic of homelessness amongst women over the age of 45 in Australia. Yes, homelessness amongst women over the age of 45 in Australia. A growing epidemic. I couldn't quite wrap my head around it. Didn't even know this was a thing. This news story had me hook, line and sinker. So it turns out there is this whole generation of women, my generation I might add, that prioritised raising their kids and looking after their families over earning money in a job or forging a career for themselves. And selflessly, they put all they had into everyone else around them, making sure everyone else was okay. Then they reach a certain age, and their children start leaving home, and then for one reason or another, so does the husband. And then these women are left to start fending for themselves when, fending for themselves hasn't really been a thing before. If they're very lucky, they're left with half a house or half a mortgage that they may not be able to pay. They then need to go and get a job, which, given they've had limited work experience in their lives, they get jobs that they're capable of, like retail or cleaning, or if they're lucky, administration. And I say if they're lucky, because at least administration is not physically taxing like retail or cleaning type jobs. Because another thing that starts to happen in your 40s and 50s, no matter how fit and healthy you are, is your back and your back goes and your joints start letting you know they're there. So doing a job that's physically taxing it's taxing and it's not sustainable long term for many of us. Oh, and did I mention that most of these types of jobs aren't really well paying? So the women end up scraping by from week to week if they're lucky. Some are not so lucky and they end up without a proper home. At first they move to a smaller, cheaper place, then the bills and other expenses pile up and they find themselves sharing with someone else, be it a friend, a family or a stranger. Arrangements like this, from personal experience, I know they very seldom work out for the long term. So, women may then need to move on to something else. This time it might just be staying in the spare room of their kid's place or their sister, or, it might only be for a few weeks or a few months until they can get back on their feet. But again, this is never a long-term solution. Some women end up in shelters and some on the streets, and government housing is just not really an option because the waiting lists are longer than the Great Wall of China, and even then, they're not guaranteed. Oh, and the other thing too is that because these women either didn't work at all while raising their families, or they may have worked part-time, they were either earning minimal or no superannuation at all. So they don't have that to fall back on when they turn 55 and eligible to cash it out. The aged pension doesn't kick in until you're in your 60s, and even when it does, it isn't nearly enough to live in a place on your own and eat at the same time. So what do women do? We can't be relying upon men to provide for us our whole lives. I mean, besides the fact that we live longer than men on average anyway, why should they provide for us wholly and solely? Now, before you get up in arms about how important it is for women to be at home and raise the kids and do all the things, I agree with you. I agree that working full-time while trying to raise kids is just not an option because let's face it, kids take up a lot of time, not to mention all the school extracurricular activities that we become taxi drivers for. And I only have one child to do all that for. I can't imagine doing it for 3 or 4. So you might be wondering by about now why I've told you this big, long, seemingly pointless story about me, my husband's legs, our business, homeless women, and superannuation. Well, I do actually have a point to make, and that is that even when I thought I was in a great place with an education and the dream house and a successful business, the rug was nearly pulled out from under me, and I shat my pants. I shat my pants so bad that it made me, change them and go out and find something for myself. I'd seen many online entrepreneurs sprouting that they had made a zillion dollars in their first week. While I knew that was pretty bloody ridiculous, I also knew there was some truth to it and that I wanted to do something entrepreneurial. I also knew I never wanted to go back working for a wage again without all the freedom and the flexibility that being a business owner gives me, for all those school events and taxiing the kids around. So I started with a drop shipping business, setting up an online shop and getting things shipped directly from China to your customers for nix. I hated it. It was so unfulfilling and it made me feel like a fraud. I then started helping a friend who wanted to start a business. It just started with a casual coffee date to give her some business advice, which led to every Saturday morning sitting around my dining table, drinking copious amounts of tea and coffee and talking all things business. She knew how I felt about the drop shipping and that I wanted something more fulfilling. And I remember she turned to me one day and I swear she screeched it. It was like, this is what you should do, Mac. Business coaching. I've got to say, I protested profusely. If I knew one thing, it was that I did not want to be one of those online business coaches who shared their whole entire life with the world of social media just to get clients. No, that was not for me. But then it was. The idea slowly grew on me, and I even had a friend at a party tell me, you can't do that, which just spurred me on and made my decision final. And so it began. I'll admit I had loads of business knowledge, but no official coaching experience, unless you count all the people that I coached or counselled when I worked in human resources, which kind of counts. Anyway, I mapped out how I'd set up my new business and I even called it Mama's Business Academy. But after a few months of procrastination, I just knew my heart still wasn't quite in it. I had a crisis and I was lost and I didn't know what I should do for my business. But after all these months of festering on the notion that women need to achieve their own financial security in this world to make the most of this one great life that we have, never mind just making it to the end with dignity, I just knew that I wanted to help women. I just needed to figure out how. And then I did, kind of indirectly. I remember it clearly. I was sitting on the toilet flicking through Instagram, as you do, and I saw this video from one of my dear mentors. She was going through a massive transformation of her own, and she came out with this one line about how everything in our lives is a story. And I paused and I started the video again, and I reckon I must have watched that video 7 or 8 times. How did I not know that everything in our lives was just a story? Like, I'm a smart woman. I did a human resources degree and some psych at uni. Why don't I know this? Anyway, I'll delve into that whole story and everything behind that in another podcast episode. But this information sent me into research overdrive. To cut a long story a bit shorter, I went on to discovering what a transformational coach was and how they understand how the brain works, and therefore they coach people to achieve things in a way that basically hacks the brain. Just an aside, I love hacks of any kind. So to find that there were brain hacks really lit my Christmas tree up. I found a coaching course and convinced Graham that spending a week in Sydney and quite a few $1,000s on a coaching certification was a great idea, and I was off. I came away from that course absolutely mind blown. That was last year. And since then, I've been doing some one-on-one coaching while I'm still trying to figure out how I can serve women in a much broader capacity. I love writing, so I started a blog, but I knew that I wasn't getting the traction that I needed in order to reach the women that I wanted to reach. I've built up an audience on Instagram and Facebook, but I also haven't been that great in putting myself out there in the socials. So after years of listening to podcasts, I started toying with the idea of creating my own. But as my daughter would say, how the heckadees would I do that? Along came my podcasting mentor, Carly Nemo, and the rest is now history. So here I am, nearly finished with my first ever podcast episode. I'm still alive to tell the tale, and I think I might even be game enough to publish this and actually send it out to the world. It's not been easy for me because I've always cared way too much what other people thought of me, and I've even judged myself too harshly. I went through all the, but no one will want to listen to me's, and what will everyone think of me's? And after a little bit of brain hacking on myself, I'm coming out on the other side of it. And because my message is so much bigger than me, and ladies out there need to hear it. I have a ton of stories to tell, loads of brain hacking wisdom to share. And I want this podcast to be a bit of a mixture of stories, teaching, tips and tricks, drawing on the wisdom of other people in interviews. And I think it's just going to evolve over time, just as I have. So I want to thank you for listening. I know I'm not going to get this right the first time, but I'm a recovering perfectionist, and perfection just doesn't really exist. We've just got to get stuff done and get it out there into the world. Otherwise, we'll just never do it. So I just want to thank you so much for listening. I hope you'll tune in again next week. And I think I might elaborate a little bit more next week on those stories of everything in our life is a story. So thanks again for listening. I'll talk to you next week. Bye. And that, my beautiful friends, is another episode of The Midlife Awakening. If you'd like more inspiration or to connect with other midlifers, head on over to my Facebook group, Deliberately Transformed. You'll find the link in the show notes. Until next time, cheers.